There is a kind of war that doesn't end when the fighting stops. The embassies are rebuilt, the convoys move on, but the trauma, political, personal, stays. Sometimes it grows. In 2006, I had just joined LBC, and my first assignment was covering the war between Israel and Hezbollah, a war that tore through southern Lebanon and tore through the idea that journalists could stay detached. That's where my reporting for war zones began. And that's where my guest today, Ambassador Rayan Kroker, served way before me. I'm Joe Khawli. For 2 decades, I have covered the fragile edge between policy and pain. From Lebanon to Syria to Egypt to Turkey and Washington. And here's something I have learned. When people say diplomacy is just talk, they have never stood in the city where the buildings are falling and the only thing left to offer is actually words. Welcome to The Diplomat, where we decode what power says and what it tries not to say. My guest, Ambassador Rayan Kroker, has been called America's last honest broker. He served as U.S. ambassador in more war zones than most generals: Beirut, Baghdad, Kabul, Damascus, Islamabad. He was inside the United States Embassy in Beirut when it was bombed in 1983. He met Bashar al-Assad before the world knew his name. He also warned against the Iraq War before it began and helped manage its darkest years after it did. And when the United States was losing its grip in Afghanistan, they called him out of retirement. In this episode, we'll talk about the sentence he chose to say after the Beirut bombing and why it changed everything. Why Bashar was never a reformer and the signs we ignored. And what Crocker told young diplomats who walked into war zones with nothing but a flag and a voice. Because some diplomats shake hands at summits and others stand inside bombed buildings and say, "We are still here." This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks. And this is a conversation you won't hear anywhere else. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us on this episode of The Diplomat. Let's start with the bombing. April 1983, you were inside the U.S. Embassy in Beirut when it was hit. What did you learn in that moment about what kind of terror we were facing and what kind of diplomacy we needed after that?
When one experiences an action like the Beirut Embassy bombing of April 18, 1983, one's initial reactions are not long-term thinking of causes and consequences. For me, it was a moment that was started with a bright flash at the corner of my office window, and then a force propelled me across the room. I heard no noise, and I thought at first that my office had been hit by a rocket-propelled grenade that had happened about a year before. But when I got to my feet and looked out my door, I saw that half the building was gone, and I knew that it was not a rocket-propelled grenade. What we learned in the aftermath was that we had real lethal enemies. This was the worst loss of American diplomatic life in the history of the country, and that we were in a new era.
And that new era, was it the rise of religious state-backed terrorism?
It was the first major example of state-backed terrorism. I'm hesitant to use the term religious. I think in the Middle East, these are power dynamics. This was the Islamic Republic of Iran using non-conventional means to achieve its foreign policy objectives. In other words, terror attacks on the embassy and then 6 months later on the Marine barracks.
And back then, how the shift of the U.S. presence or absence in the region shifted?
Well, in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, the embassy and in October of 1983, the Marine barracks, the U.S. militarily withdrew from the region. And that sent a message to Tehran and to Damascus that the Americans don't have staying power, that you may not be able to prevent their interventions, but you can outlast them. They won't have the patience for the long fight. And when I got to Iraq, almost 25 years later, that was the dynamic in play. The Iranians were fostering sectarian conflict through their support for Iraqi Shia militias. In the east and in the west, Syria was facilitating al-Qaeda attacks there. And their calculation was driven by their thinking in Beirut, that you can make the Americans bleed and they will go home. This time, we showed them a different side. President Bush ordered the surge, not a withdrawal. And I think that confounded the thinking in both Tehran and Damascus, and has led over time, with a lot of fits and starts, to a certain precarious stability and security in Iraq today.
You mentioned after this hit on the US Embassy, Washington learned that taking sides sometimes was not very strategic. And what was the taking sides taught the State Department and Washington?
The lesson I derived first from Lebanon was be careful what you get into. That interventions in other people's countries, in other people's conflicts, can have repercussions that are impossible to prepare for or even imagine. So be very careful what you get into. Be certain that your actions have a specific purpose and that that purpose is achievable. And you have to calculate how your intervention is going to be perceived and reacted to by others. And I would suggest that in Lebanon, we were not very careful.
What kind of diplomacy was needed after that?
It would be the diplomacy of endurance, of simply putting aside the personal shock, grief, and sense of loss, and remembering that we were there for a purpose, to advance U.S. interests in Lebanon and the region at a critical time. And I was very proud of my colleagues for their ability to focus on just that, that we had all experienced grave loss of colleagues, of friends, but the mission was uppermost, just getting on with the job.
What were the early views on how the US presence or absence shifts regional power after that?
I think the bombing was a very decisive moment in regional history, and certainly for the United States in the Middle East. As I look back on that period, this was the time, of course, of the Israeli invasion of 1982, the landing of the Marines, the involvement of U.S. warships directly in the Lebanese conflict. What we had done was to take sides in a Lebanese civil war. We didn't intend to. That was not our aim or our ambition, but that is how it was perceived. And once we did that, we became a party to the conflict, and that resulted in the bombing of the embassy and later the bombing of the Marine barracks 6 months later. So that actions have consequences.
So do you think it was a wrong strategic positioning?
Look, Joseph, I've learned maybe two things in the course of a very long career. One of them is be careful what you get into, particularly if that involves the use of military force or even a military presence. That be sure that you fully understand the dynamics of the situation you're involving yourself in, and think through not just third and fourth order consequences, but 30th and 40th order consequences. Because again, this is a complex region. Every shift, every move will occasion counter moves by allies and adversaries alike. And before you move, you've got to think about those things. I would suggest that we did not think about those things very carefully in Lebanon.
And going back to Bashar al-Assad when he came to power, and you met with him, and the West did not know his name, did not know who Bashar al-Assad is. What did you know about him that the world missed or didn't know about Bashar al-Assad?
In the fall of 1999, when I was ambassador to Syria, I got a curious request from the foreign minister, Farouk Ashara at the time, and that was to have a private meeting with the son of the president, Bashar al-Assad. No particular agenda, just an opportunity for him to get to know me. And I thought it curious at the time. We met up at the People's Palace on the hilltop overlooking Damascus and spent about 3 hours together. And I came away from that meeting with the sense that the growing view in the West that somehow Bashar al-Assad was a Western-oriented liberal proto-democrat was not correct. Our conversation was entirely in Arabic, even though he had studied his postdoctorate ophthalmology studies in Britain. He was not comfortable in English at that time. He'd had no interaction with British society. And my conclusion from that first meeting, and there was a subsequent meeting as well, was that he would be less flexible, less creative, and more rigid than his father. That his exposure to the West had not overcome the education he'd had at the knees of his father and his so-called uncles, the pillars of the Assad establishment.
So the idea that he was a reformer was dispelled.
Yeah, I never, after those encounters with him in the fall of 1999, I reported to Washington that this is in no way a reformer, that he will be harder to deal with and more rigid than his father.
And the U.S. Embassy attack, when the mobs were state-sanctioned, what does that mean?
That was December of 1998 when a mob attacked the embassy and then attacked my residence. They were repulsed from the attack on the embassy itself by tear gas dispensed by the Marines. They regrouped and then attacked my unprotected house. It was clear to us from the outset of that attack that this was a state-sanctioned demonstration and a state-sanctioned attack. And I made that clear to the Syrian government in no uncertain terms. They acknowledged that in a tacit kind of way by paying compensation for the damage that was done to my house. That is, in diplomatic terms, an acknowledgement of responsibility.
And you said this is not random terror. This is how Syria exported it. What did you mean?
You can draw a connection between, say, the Beirut embassy attack, which was carried out by Lebanese elements under the supervision and direction of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and with the full knowledge and support of Syria. It was the use of terror, if you will, of non-conventional means to further foreign policy objectives. And the embassy attack 15 years later in Damascus was a milder version of the same kind of tactic. This was a regime that would use violence against embassy facilities in full contravention of the Vienna Convention to achieve its foreign policy objectives.
You arrived in Baghdad during the surge, sectarian violence everywhere. You worked side by side with the General David Petraeus. What was your hardest day in Iraq?
There were a lot of hard days in Iraq. I think the most difficult may have been a second attack in June of 2007 on the Golden Mosque in Samarra. An earlier attack in February of 2006 had touched off the horrific sectarian conflict, and this second attack was obviously intended by al-Qaeda to reignite it. And I remember that General Petraeus and I, as soon as we got the news, we went to see Prime Minister al-Maliki, and with him we worked out a strategy whereby he would invite the Sunni vice president of Iraq, at that time Tariq al-Hashimi, to his office, and they would issue a joint statement, the leading Sunni figure and the leading Shia figure in the Iraqi government, calling for restraint and to avoid violence in reaction to this awful attack, and that he would reach out to Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf to do the same. And they followed through on this, and we did avert another spike of sectarian violence, but it was a very close thing.
Mm. You said Iraq is a traumatized society and will be for some time.
Yes, again, the Uh, Iraqi history didn't start in 2003. Many Americans think it did with the invasion. But the trauma went through long before that, under the awful reign of Saddam Hussein, where he turned not just sect against sect, but family against family, and family members against each other. It was a true reign of terror. So you add that trauma to the trauma of the invasion and the subsequent sectarian violence, and you have a truly traumatized society. Yet I was there. I was in Baghdad in just 2 months ago for a conference, and I had a chance to connect with old friends, Arab Sunnis, Arab Shia, Kurds, Christians, and everybody was unhappy. Everybody was complaining. Corruption, lack of services, lack of economic opportunity, decline in the quality of education. Everybody was unhappy, but the security was excellent. And it reminded me a little bit of American society, where everybody at home is unhappy, everybody's complaining, but we're hanging together as a society. And I came away from that visit to Baghdad feeling a little bit optimistic that after all of the trauma and turmoil that country has been through, it may yet emerge as an anchor of stability and democracy in the Middle East.
Can we compare Iraq's post-war debates to U.S. civil rights movement?
One of the reasons that the violence of 2006 and 2007 was so awful was because Iraqi society was so intermixed. Sunni and Shia families were intermarried as a matter of course. Communities were mixed, neighborhoods were mixed. Iraq, unlike Lebanon, had no history of sectarian violence. Yet, with the fall of Saddam and the stripping away of all other social and political identities, all that was left was sect, and that produced the sectarian conflict of 06-07, which was horrifically violent, but it was an exception.
If we want to bring up the 22 memo, The Perfect Storm, and the warning against what you just described as an invasion, others call it military presence, what's the most misunderstood part of America's presence in Iraq even today?
Well, again, our presence today is significant, but it is a fraction of what it was during my time as ambassador. And you don't see American uniforms on the streets. Security is entirely in the hands of Iraqis. And what I heard during my time in Baghdad 2 months ago was that the relationship with America is very important to all Iraqis. They want us there. I think what was misunderstood by Americans and Iraqis alike is the nature of our intervention in the first place. We saw ourselves as the great liberators, the force that was finally removing the heel of the tyrant Saddam Hussein from the neck of his people. Iraqis saw us differently. They saw us as a continuation of foreign intervention and foreign presence. We were the successor in Iraqi eyes to the Brits, who had held Iraq as a mandate after World War I. And we were largely seen as an occupying power, not a liberating one. And again, I don't think Americans understood that narrative, and I don't think Iraqis understood that that was the last thing we intended.
You came out of retirement to serve in Afghanistan in 2011. You helped shape the strategic partnership. Why did you come back, and what did you see that others didn't?
I had retired after Iraq in 2009, and a year later, I was dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. The Bush School is named after President George H.W. Bush. Bush 41, perhaps our greatest statesman as president that we've ever had. And I was very happy there. But when I got a call from Washington as dean of the school asking me if I would consider going to Iraq, to Afghanistan as ambassador, there was only one answer I could give. When your president asks you to serve the nation in a time of war, all you can say is yes. And the surge was already underway in Afghanistan. I saw it as a hopeful moment, and I saw there's some opportunity for long-term stability and a strategic partnership with Afghanistan.
Why
I was proud to go.
Why did you think, or do you think the president picked you for that specific mission?
Well, it was, again, this is President Obama who asked me to serve in Afghanistan. I was an ambassador 6 times, 3 times for Republican presidents and 3 times for Democratic presidents. And that's the nature of the Foreign Service. We are apolitical. Nobody elected us. We serve those the people did elect. And we do so to the utmost of our ability, whatever the policy. And I think that President Obama saw me as, again, a loyal civil servant, someone who would do his best for his administration as I had done for previous administrations.
What was the need for political settlements, not just military ones?
The essence of any conflict is political. Wars arise out of politics, and they must be resolved through politics. And I think we understood that clearly, certainly during the time I was there, not just me, but General John Allen, who commanded all coalition forces in Afghanistan. And that is why we worked so hard to bring about the Strategic Framework Agreement between the United States and Afghanistan that President Obama traveled to Kabul, the last American president to do so, to sign in May of 2012. That ultimately this represented not just a strategic agreement between the United States and Afghanistan, but it represented a consensus among Afghans reached through a Loya Jirga that President Karzai convened at the outset of negotiations that resulted in unanimous support for a strategic partnership. So it not only bound the United States and Afghanistan closer together, it served to bind Afghans themselves closer together.
And you called for the Afghan-led negotiations with the Taliban.
My view at the time was that, again, some form of reconciliation between the Taliban and the Afghan government was necessary, not between the United States and the Taliban, but as part of an intra-Afghan dialogue. And I took the position that we would support what President Karzai and his government wanted to do in terms of negotiations and contact with the Taliban. That was my position at the time. I participated in several meetings with Taliban-connected individuals, but only at the request of the Afghan government. The Afghan government had to lead.
How do you reflect on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan? Was it rushed, or what was missing?
Well, what was missing was an appreciation of reality on the ground. That was a very sad moment for the United States, for the region, and certainly for the Afghan people. At the time that President Biden ordered the full withdrawal of all U.S. forces from Afghanistan, we only had about 3,500 troops left in country. And we were not engaged in direct combat operations. Our presence was symbolic, and it was also critically important to sustain the logistics of the Afghan security forces. When we pulled out all of our support for those forces. And I think their collapse was inevitable, and it didn't have to be.
What was rushed?
Well, the whole notion that we had to be completely out of Afghanistan, not just our forces, but also our contractors who were sustaining Afghan forces. That was rushed, and it was unnecessary. We could have sustained that presence indefinitely.
You have served in almost every major U.S. conflict zone in the Middle East. What do you say to young diplomats who walk into the room after bombs fall?
Well, you want to be in the room where it happens. You want to be where the action is, even if it is hard, difficult, and dangerous. You want to look back at your time in service as being where it made a difference. And for me, those places were places often of conflict, of real danger. But I can't think of anywhere more important to be than places where the bombs are falling and the bullets are flying.
What's your philosophy behind the strategic patience?
Well, that was one of the things I learned that is so critical for diplomatic success in the Middle East: strategic patience, the ability to take a long view, to be slow to make a commitment, but to sustain that commitment once it's made. And we Americans are a great people. We have many great attributes, but strategic patience is not one of them. We built our country on impatience. Let's get her done. Let's go west. Let's build the railroad.
Why did you warn against short attention spans and checklist diplomacy? What did you mean by that?
We like things in America to be clear and cut, black and white, check the box, mission accomplished. But the world doesn't work that way, and the Middle East doesn't in particular. That you have to take a long view, you have to look at trends rather than specific concrete achievements. And that's what we saw in Iraq. I was under great pressure to achieve certain benchmarks. And I argued against the entire system of benchmarks, that you have to look at longer term trends and you have to sustain a commitment if you're going to achieve progress. And above all, you have to have fully invested local partners. It's ultimately not our country. It is not our war. It is that of other people and other states. And we have got to sustain our support and follow their lead.
Reflecting on what you said before and what you just repeated now, Americans want quick fixes. The region doesn't work that way. Is this concept understood today?
I'm not sure it is. Although it has been interesting watching the Trump administration in its first months. For example, the meeting with al-Assad. The president, I think, had lots of advice not to hold such a meeting, not to move to remove sanctions on the Syrian government, but to play for time and let things sort themselves out. He took a bold step, and that to me is encouraging. He also took a bold step in the recent conflict between India and Pakistan. The initial approach of the administration was let them sort it out.
So is he acting not against, but differently than what his advisors are telling him, you think?
Well, again, in our system, the president is the decider. He has advisors, they give advice, but ultimately it is the president who makes decisions. And he has made some bold ones and some that I think were not entirely predictable, as the meeting with al-Assad and the decisive intervention he made to prevent a further escalation between India and Pakistan.
Do you think this would help the region in a way to dismantle that connection between Syria and Iran, Lebanon and Iran?
I think so. I have argued since the revolution in Syria in December that while there were some problematic aspects of the new order in Syria, most fundamentally, it severed the connection between Iran and Lebanon and Iran and Hezbollah. And that is a major strategic interest of the United States and indeed of Israel. So anything we can do to further that distance, that separation, is in our interest.
Engaging with like a new deal, nuclear deal with Iran by Trump, how strategic is that, and how could also affect the detachment from Iran and its impact on Syria and Lebanon?
Iran did not have a good year in 2024. Its proxy forces in Gaza and in Lebanon were badly defeated, and they lost their only ally in the Arab world with the Syrian revolution. And then the direct conflict between Israel and Iran did not go so well for Iran. So I think this is a moment for some strategic rethinking in Tehran on what the long-term interests of Iran and its people are and how this government should posture itself. And we will see how these negotiations go.
And the bold moves by Trump would force the Iranian regime to talk directly with him?
Well, the talks are ongoing, of course, brokered by the Omanis, and we'll see where they go. But again, the Iranians are masters of strategic patience. They know how to wait, they know how to bide their time, and we will see how well we do in these talks.
After all this, Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, Kabul, what's the one word or sentence or phrase you remember choosing with care because it could shift everything?
It's the one sentence that we've both used in this conversation, strategic patience. That you've got to be prepared for the long term, that you cannot seize the moment and consider that that gives you victory and a decisive outcome.
But which you said that Iran has strategic patience and the United States doesn't.
Exactly. And I think we need to improve our strategic patience.
Could we learn that from from the Iranian regime?
We can learn a lot of things from the Iranian people.
Mm.
It is one of the most developed cultures in the world with a tremendous literature, great contributions to philosophy and the arts. The regime is another matter.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Diplomat. If this conversation stayed with you, good. It should. That means the lessons haven't expired. You can follow the show on your favorite platform. And if this spoke to something you have seen, lived, or questioned, share it. Share it with someone who still believes diplomacy is not dead. It's just buried under the noise. Every week, I sit down with people who have shaped history from the front lines of policy, conflict, and consequence. Because language isn't just what we talk about power and politics, it's what power and politics talk. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks.